Hi guys, this is Tom. This is Quick Watercolour Birds Despite the Elephant. In this episode we're going a little bit more exotic than the last few ones with the garden birds and a little bit more colour, so let's go. I seem to say this in every single video, but this is another one of my favourite birds. You may have noticed there's quite a few of them. These ones, if you've seen the flamingo one, I talk about how flamingos, they always kind of elude me a little bit, and I'm always kind of chasing the perfect flamingo, and therefore I've painted a lot of flamingos. I'm always drawn to paint more. There's just something about them. In this one we're going to be painting a bee eater, and in particular a European bee eater. There's many different types of bee eaters. I'll probably be painting most of them over the course of this series, but this is the European bee eater. In many ways, like some of the garden birds we've been looking at, and also the kingfisher, we've got all of these different segments of colours, and one of the hardest things is managing these segments of colours. Although we want lots of wet into wet, we want the paint to flow together, we want loads of interesting stuff to happen, at the same time there's certain colours that we don't want to flow together because they're going to kind of muddy each other. So I'm going to talk about that in this. Also, this is one of the first ones where I very much do a very specific kind of two-part process, and it's a very common one in watercolour, where we do a much lighter kind of wet into wet first wash. We pretty much let that dry off and then go on the top of that with some more shadowy washes, some dry brushwork and a little bit of detail. But yeah, as always, we're looking for something quick, expressive, capturing the character of the bird and not getting bogged down in detail. I'm going to talk a little bit more about the line drawing, which you can find over on Patreon. And don't forget, you can find me at all my other platforms in the links down below, including Patreon, where I do a lot more teaching, a lot more in-depth tutorials about all different aspects of painting, including loads of stuff about birds and loads of stuff about watercolour. So that's it guys, without further ado, let's dive into the drawing and then into the painting. Let's go. Okay guys, so the first thing we're going to look at here is the drawing. This is the basic drawing. It's got all of the usual principles. I'm looking for big shapes first. So the way I tackled this when I first drew it out was looking for the kind of egg shape that represents the body, because it's a good place to start, either the head or the egg shape of the body. Thinking again about the angle through the body, or the tilt of the body. The nice opposing angle of the head, so we get this kind of zigzag shape or V shape on its side, which is always a nice dynamic kind of composition. Again, thinking about the head shape, starting with the general shape first, and then thinking about the smaller shapes of the eye band and the beak kind of stuck on afterwards. And again, what's the angle through there? It's not flat, it's not that way, it's not too far that way, it's very specifically that way. And then once we've got that basic framework down, then I start to think about almost sticking the other shapes on top. So we work from general and big through to the specific shapes kind of stuck on top of that. One thing I wanted to talk about here was using the line drawing, which if you go over to my Patreon page, and they're all public posts, you can find the line drawing of all of this series. And a few people have asked what exactly you can do with the line drawing. Well, what's great about the line drawing is it means that you haven't got all the colour and everything to distract you if you're trying to follow through on this tutorial. The line drawing is great just to have up on the screen and attempt to copy that or draw from it, and you can always make your own little tweaks and alterations and things. But one thing that you can also do is you can print it off, and obviously you can print it off at different sizes to suit what you're working on. And the way that I did this one was I actually did the drawing first, and then I put it into my laptop, turned it into a line drawing, and then I printed it off again. And what I did then to recreate what some of you might want to do is, once you've printed it off, if you go onto the back then and hold it up against the window, take like a 2B or softer pencil works quite well, and just scribble over the line. So you do it for a window so you can see the line, scribble over the top, maybe smudge it a bit with your finger, and you're effectively creating like a graphite layer on the back here. Flip it over, decide where you want it on your page, lay it down, hold it still, and then fairly hard but not so hard that you dent the paper, just draw over the line, and then what you're left with is quite a light version. And then I just go back in and make little alterations with a slightly darker pencil, and it's a great way to take a line drawing and turn it into that. And the great thing is, you've got, if you've spent ages doing a drawing and then as I quite often do, and it does happen, you mess up the painting stage, you don't have to spend too long redrawing it out. You just whip that bit of paper off, get a clean one out, and you might need to put a bit more graphite on the back, but maybe not, and you can just trace it again and go again. So it's a great way of kind of getting the drawing element done very quickly so that you can get to the painting. Okay guys, just going to dive straight into this one. We're going to start with the yellow of the head, and I'm going to use the Indian yellow. It's one of the lighter colours on the page, so you often hear that we watercolour, we kind of work from light to dark, and you don't have to do it like that. We don't always have to start with the lighter colour, but it's not a bad place to start, certainly not on this one. And what I'm going to look at doing is just leaving a little light area there and a softer, lighter yellow in this area. And then I'm going to take some of that lovely saturated pure Indian yellow, and we're just going to keep loading that bit there. And then at some point we're going to let that kind of drop down into the lovely turquoise of the body. So I'm going to get some pure turquoise to start with. Loads of water. There's a lot of water going on at the moment, very watery wash. We've got this lovely bead, and I'm working on a slight slope, so this bead is gonna, this yellow is now going to shoot into the turquoise, but I'm kind of after that sort of look. I want the colour to all flow together. It's a little bit too strong a turquoise, so I'm going to get some of my Maganese Blue and just blew it up a bit, basically. We're going to leave the light from there and that into there. Nice dry brush to get some of these brush strokes in here, nice and simple. Let's break that. I didn't mean to do that, but let's work with it. Kind of down into there. Nice. Just, you've seen me do it before with the backgrounds. Just nice, simple but expressive kind of backgrounds. Let all that paint kind of flow together. Here, a bit more yellowy up here. Look at the way that colour flows together so beautifully. It's not something we can always plan, which is the joy of watercolour. And then we've got this lovely light side. So while it's still wet, make sure we capture some lovely light in here. Keep it wet, that's the trick to the wash. And then just kind of see what you end up with. We've got some lovely stuff going on here. Gonna leave a nice little patch of white there, just to denote kind of abstract areas of light, and just keep that all kind of flooding together. See what kind of happens in that area. Yeah, that'll all settle down nicely. And then down here we're going to get into a bit more Maganese Blue, and just while it's still drying, just get that all kind of flowing a little bit more. There we go. Just pop in some extra colours at the moment. Now's a nice stage to do it. And that's it. I've got a lovely flow of colour from the head, the yellow in the head, down into the body. We've left some nice little abstract areas of light which help liven up the painting a little bit more. And we are going to get into, we'll do that as a separate brush stroke later. I mean, really, I want to just let that all dry off. It doesn't need a lot. What we can do is take some of that background colour and give it, let's give it a little bit more of a gentle green to trap some light on the bird here, and eventually this will be a different colour as well. It might go a little bit darker, something like that. So it's just, while it's wet, I'm just going to very carefully just hit that turquoise there and let it bleed together in that one area, and then let that kind of flow down into here. Just let those colours flow together a little bit more. Something like that. So getting a nice soft edge in this kind of area. The gravity, because we're working kind of downhill effectively, is keeping this bead here. I just need to make sure that bead doesn't backwash and that turquoise is a little bit more spread out. We've got a lovely soft edge down here. So that's got some nice little features to it. That's some interesting stuff going on. We kind of treat the head as its own little separate area now, so we can go back to our this beautiful colour which is called, by Daniel Smith, called Aussie Red Gold, and it's a beautiful colour. Actually, before we do that, I'm just going to clean out my brush. And what we're going to do is just take a bit of that yellow with a fair amount of water in it and just look at creating, they always have this lovely little shot of blue, or often do, just there. And just going to take that and strengthen it a little bit with a touch more pigment. And yeah, that's all kind of working nicely. So I'm now going to, with very little water, sorry, very little pigment and quite a lot of water, just going to take that colour and bring it over here just to trap the light on the beak. It's not so true to life, but I'm not hugely worried about that. It's more just using it to trap the light on the beak there. We could do it in a different way, but I'm just kind of feeling it to do it like that. And then we're going to take now that Aussie Gold I was just talking about. So beautiful Aussie Gold. The kind of like, I don't know, Indian Yellow meets Burnt Sienna by Daniel Smith. It's got this beautiful richness to it. We're going to come actually from here and hopefully run out of pigment a little bit, so I get a kind of drier, kind of dry brush in some senses there, and let those colours flow together a little bit more. And that's a beautiful colour to have on the top of the head. I've done an okay job of leaving a few little speckles of the light of the page, just so it doesn't feel too I've gone a little bit wrong there. Nothing too major, just I could let it kind of do that. Let's sit with it. Let's just roll with that. Let's just let's make sure we just throw in a little bit more turquoise to counteract it, something like that. There we go. That's the kind of thing we're after. And then what I'm going to do is load in a slightly deeper colour. So we take the Aussie Gold and a bit of burnt sienna, less water, more pigment, and now we're going to do this sort of a thing and just kind of work into what we've got there, going a little bit, maybe use even a little bit of line just there. That's not quite working, so dry brush, just going to soften it down a touch, something like that. That's kind of working. What I am going to do though is there's too much pigment up here, so I'm going to go in with a damp brush and just pull out some of that pigment, make it a slightly lighter forehead, and then go back to my big brush and create an even more saturated pigment and even darker. So Quinacridone Magenta, a bit of the burnt sienna. That's far too muddy a colour, so more burnt sienna, more red, less blue, and let's just feed in a lovely rich kind of dark into that colour. And then we're just going to let those colours do what they want to do. Let's let them flow a little bit more. Let's drop a bit more kind of red in there and just let all that colour flow a little bit more. Let's drop a bit more Aussie Gold in there, and let's just let all of that colour flow together. Let's not try and control it too much. I was almost getting a bit controlled for that area, and it was kind of suffering for it. So it's a good example of actually, let's just let the watercolour paint itself in many ways. So let's go now onto the back here. That lovely Aussie Gold again with a relatively watery mix, but not too much in the brush. And what that allows me to do is get this lovely kind of broken brush stroke, that sort of a thing. But because I'm doing it quickly and with not too much pigment, we're also getting a lovely broken brush stroke. So now we go back to our kind of lovely red pigment, and I'm just going to drop that in there while it's still wet. Nice quick hits of the brush, and we can go darker in here. So let's just chuck a load of pigment into that area and into there, like all the way along there. Let it all kind of link together a little bit. But because again we're working downhill, we can afford to do that and it won't destroy that lovely slightly lighter yellow tone. Let's keep some of that red out of it. And then what I'm going to do is get progressively darker and more saturated, so less water, more pigment, and we're just going to kind of throw a bit of dark down into the base of the wing here. And then I'm going to move over here, which is a dry area of my palette, but we can reignite watercolour. I've just got a bit of blue knocking about that I'm going to chuck a load of the Quinacridone Red into, and that's just going to give us a lovely rich deep dark. We might just drop a tiny touch in there, and we're not far off now, kind of moving into the second stage of the painting. Really it's all about darks in the second stage. We could let it all dry off, or I can kind of keep working. I'm just trying to feel my way at this stage, which route we go. I'm going to pull that out a little bit. I like what's happening on the top of the head there. That's the sort of stuff you can't necessarily plan, which is nice. I'm going to go to a slightly smaller brush now, because I find I need a bit more accuracy when I come into the head here. So burnt sienna, ultramarine, a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of red, and I'm just going to start basically coming in and just working in this area here, and I'm doing it while this bit is still wet, so we get some lovely wet into wet kind of work going on. We'll get some really lovely things happening if I do that. Bit of dry brush, and bring that dark up just a little bit more. Don't want to destroy those whites of the page that I've got there, because they're really important. But I'm actually going to paint around them and drop in now a really rich deep dark while I've got the opportunity to do so, kind of wet into wet. Let's go really dark. Burnt sienna and my ultramarine and the red, so it doesn't feel a bit too dead. The red kind of livens it up a little bit, and just some really saturated pigment in that area. And I'll worry about the eye later and do it with some opaque colour later. It's just easier. And yeah, we're getting a really nice feeling of form in that area. So now let's go. No, we'll save that till later. We'll go in here with a damp brush and just try and reserve some of the lights on the head in there, but trap some of the light just there. And keep that beak really simple. Easy to overstate the beak, but we'll just keep it really simple, something like that. And again, this is quick watercolor birds, so this isn't about detail, this is about expressiveness, quick brush strokes, capturing the essence of the bird, not worrying too much about the details. A little bit more red in it, a little bit more red in it. Touch in there. I'll tell you what, we're not far off there, just taking a quick breather while we let that first layer dry off, and then we can come back. Just going to pull out that little bit there, it's a bit too, it's not quite right. Best to leave it alone if it's not quite right. So that's a great place to take a quick breather and let all of that dry off, and have a little quick tip section. Okay guys, so this is going to be a very quick and simple quick tips, and again, something that's so important in watercolour is paint consistency, and one very useful tool is kind of dry brush. So what we see if we add a lot of water to our mixture, not going to be the prettiest colour here, but lots of water to our mixture, you know, it fills all the gaps predominantly, and then if we use a slightly lighter touch and do it quickly, we get these lovely broken brush strokes, which for me give a real liveliness to the paint, and this is something we can accentuate by using less and less water and more pigment. And one thing that's really great in watercolour, aside from these lovely broken brush strokes where the light of the page kind of shines through a little bit, is using the dry brush to really bring a watercolour to life. And what we end up with is a lovely contrast of much smoother, more gentle washes, in contrast to kind of sharper, more direct marks over the top with far less water and much more pigment, so this sort of thing. And you can even push down quite hard and you won't get much kind of paint working into there, so we very much get a broken brush stroke. And the trick is learning how much water to use, as always. So just a touch more water will give us a slightly more flowing mark, but still a lovely dry brush like that. And they're great for kind of bringing a piece to life, sharpening areas up, especially good for little details, surprisingly. we tend to think a bit more water so it flows more neatly would be good for detail, but actually sometimes your dry brush can be great for detail too. It also works especially well, and it's something I've kind of touched on before, but in not such a purposeful way, as if we've got a lovely fairly wet wash or damp wash like that, and then we mix our dry mix, sometimes a little bit of water to help it move. And what can work really nicely, and it works especially well on wings of birds. Imagine that's like the wing of a bird and we're bringing it to a fine point here. If we do a kind of dry brush stroke, that's a bit too dry, but dry brush stroke into a wet brush stroke, we get some amazing stuff going on, like loads of wonderful stuff happening. And you can really play around with your brushes and paint consistency. As always, I recommend playing around. It's also much easier to get this broken brush stroke on rougher paper, but it's down to paint consistency, how lightly you touch the page with your brush, and also how quickly you do the brush stroke. And different brushes will give you a different look as well. Let's go in with a much softer brush. This was a synthetic brush, a little bit more springy. This is a bigger brush, a bit softer. Because it's softer, it tends to push the paint into the page a little bit more. So we have to work a little bit quicker and a little bit lighter if we want that kind of broken brush stroke. But however, when we go to much higher pigment content, much less water, we get some really lovely marks going on. And again, it's kind of stuff I've shown you in some of the other videos where we're just getting used to our tools and the way they work. But here's a great opportunity. There's a damp wash, more saturated pigment, very much a dry brush, probably almost pure pigment, and then while it's wet, we just do a dry brush stroke into it. Dry brush stroke into it, and when it hits there we get a slightly wetter brush stroke, and then we get that lovely contrast of wet into wet versus sharper detail with a dry brush. So it's something you're going to see me doing a fair amount on the second part of this painting, so it's something I just wanted to talk about a little bit more, and it's a great way of giving texture and life to a watercolour painting. So let's get into the second part of this. Okay guys, so it's all had a chance to dry off a reasonable amount. Some bits are still a bit damp, but that's kind of what we want. So we're going to go in now and we're going to look at creating some deeper shadows and starting to create a bit of form and bring this to life. So the first thing to do is to get back in here and just create a bit more shadow in this area. Just a nice strong shadow. Quick hits of the brush just cast over that area, and then it kind of just comes up there. So that's number one. We're kind of going to do that, keep it very simple. Some slightly more saturated paint, and I just want to sharpen up here and use this as an opportunity to create some wet into wet in that area, just to let a little bit of that bottom area drift into the shadow that I've just laid down of the yellow, and kind of encouraging it to run a little bit so we get a slightly more interesting shadow. And then the bee eaters, they've got this lovely kind of shape around their neck, this little ring here. So while this is wet with more saturated paint, I'm just going to hit it and take it round here and up into there. And then while that is still wet, we're going to mix an even more saturated mix, but still very warm, and just kind of brush that into there, doing something like that. And you can see very quickly we start to get a feeling of shape and form to the subject, and I'm just going to keep pushing that bit darker. It's a nice little bit in there, and it kind of links up and around there, and that gives a great bit of structure to that area. We get a lovely dark shape here. So we're using slightly drier brush strokes now, not so much water in the paint, and we need a little bit more red out. A little bit more red. I'm kind of creeping the pyrrole red in. The red isn't actually that critical, so the pyrrole is to hand, but you could stick with your quinacridone, so sorry for the slight inconsistency there, but the red isn't too important here. It's just being used to give a more purpley dark, which is kind of what we want. I'm just going to push that a little bit darker in there. And I don't want to overwork this stage now. We're going to keep it fairly simple. What I do want to do is now mix a really interesting blue, nice dark blue. Let's take our manganese predominantly and just mix a slightly darker blue, lots of turquoise still, and all it is a more shadowy colour, and we just need to think about how that's going to interact with everything. I still want that kind of yellow glow there, but this is just going to give it a little bit more feeling of light. I'm just going to bring that ever so slightly under there, and then that's going to be a lovely shadow that kind of comes under here like that. Really just keep it really simple, and then it's going to kind of stay light there but then go nice and dark there, and then we can soften that down if we want with a damp brush. We can just chuck a bit more water, neat water, into there, and that'll soften it down, maybe soften that area down. Yeah, but we've got a lovely strong shadow now. So more turquoise, more darker blue, and we're going to start pushing. While this is wet, we're going to start pushing some of these shadows darker. Let's go really dark here, but with a kind of hit of the dry brush. Let's go really dark. Let's not go really dark straight away. Let's go to the tail and try and get it with a few, bit too wet the brush. Let's try and just bring that onto there and get a more broken brush stroke. There we go. More interesting kind of brush stroke for that area. And then let's chuck a load of pigment at it. This is really fun thing to do. We just lay that, we've looked at it in some of the other videos, that kind of wash loading, and let's just take some of the colour out of it with a kind of wash breaking across that way. Something like that. Keep it really simple. And then while we've got that, a really rich deep blue with very little pigment, sorry, very little water, lots of pigment, and we just bring in a darker shadow kind of under there, and maybe we just to bring in a bit more kind of tonal variation and give it a bit more shape, we'll just kind of do that in there as well. And you see straight away we're starting to get lovely shape and form to the bird. We've got this amazing shape to the wing here, and this again I want to try and do it with a fairly dry brush, push it down and then kind of lift it up, and if it hits that still slightly wet kind of browny colour here, great. If we'll get a bit of wet into wet, but it's not so wet that it's going to destroy that area, and it's a little bit heavy if anything, so I'm just going to pull it back out and then just kind of link that together a little bit more. We've got a nice little expressive shape there that I think works really well. Let's join those darks together and bring that dark actually under the wing there, and then we start to get again a bit more form. So let's darken up that tip there. Yeah, and that's the kind of feeling that I wanted it to have. Fairly loose, fairly simple. And let's go now to some really deep saturated dark with the Pthalo Blue and the Pyrrole Red, and that's just to push some of these darks really dark. Yeah, how dark can we push it in certain areas? Let this paint kind of just flow together there, and let's go now while it's wet still, or while it's damp. I just want to go darker in there, and we're pushing that feeling of form all the time. We don't need to push every single shadow to its absolute maximum darkness. That's not what we're kind of doing, but there's some shadows that I can push darker, and that's what I'm sort of doing, push that darker under there. And really that's it for this area. Let's kind of splash that down there. That doesn't matter too much. And yeah, really we're kind of homing in on it here. There's not really actually that much more to do. I was thinking that I might go darker in this yellowy green colour. Don't really need to. We could go a little bit darker just there, and maybe just pop that wing out a little bit there, but not too much. And then we're into the feet and the branch on which it's standing, and I think here we can just be very simple. Let's go just very simple loose brush strokes. That's where 1 foot is going to be, so we're kind of going there, and then while it's still wet we introduce just a little bit more shadow kind of where the foot is, and even some shadow kind of along the bottom edge there. Just keep it really, really, really simple. Just going to come in here, and if I hit a bit of that blue, I think it's going to be okay. We shall find out, because I'm using a very saturated colour for the log and a fairly dry brush stroke, and if some of those colours kind of merge together, it's not the worst thing in the world. What I have done is forgotten about the feet there though, and I'm just going to pull that back out again, and I think we've got kind of shape there for the bottom of that foot, and I'm going to go a shape under there for the bottom of that foot, and we've just got a bit of an odd shape going on. We just need a bit more attention in this area basically. So very nice saturated pigment, and then the only other thing to do is to drop that eye in. While it's still wet, I've just about got away with adding a bit more pigment in there, and kind of there, and just make sure there is lots of pigment so that we don't get a kind of a back run or anything in that wet area. We could do more with the feet, but for me, the more we paint the feet, for me, or when I do it anyway, the worse they look. So I tend to just very lightly hint at where they are and kind of leave it at that, because our attention gets drawn to the rest of the bird. And there's a lot of stuff I thought I was going to do with this that it just doesn't need. We've got a lovely pattern and continuous wash of dark down here. That's a really lovely continuous wash. This was a nice simple wash. The head kind of painted itself once I let go and just chucked a bit of pigment in there. What we have got is just soften that dark down with a damp brush in there, so it's a bit more natural feeling. That's a very simple but very effective little bee eater. I wonder if I was expecting to want to go darker here, but I don't feel it needs it. It's enough to trap a bit of light on the front edge there. We could go a little bit darker with the underside of the branch maybe, just to give it a bit more punch. And even the branch is kind of flowing wet into the blue shadow of the bird, so that's also a nice feature. So I think for the eye, they've got this lovely red in the eye. I'm not particularly interested in putting it in. What I'm more interested in is maybe just a little highlight to denote the eye. I'm trying to work out whether it even really needs that. It's not that we couldn't do it, it's actually, I'm trying to think of a way to keep the representation of the subject fairly simple, and I think actually adding an eye in this case, I'm not really feeling drawn to do so. What I might do is let it dry off a little bit and kind of re-evaluate that in a bit, but that's it. Very, very simple. Although the first pass on the painting appears to be fairly carefree, there's still an element of it where we have to concentrate and focus on what we're doing, and it does have quite a big influence on the overall painting, but at the same time the next stage where we start to define things has an even bigger influence. So it's an interesting balance with that first wash. It is important because ideally lots of it shows through. The first wash on something is quite often the freshest feeling because it's got the most transparency to it and it feels nice and bright and light. And then there are lots of areas where it's showing through, so that first wash is significant, even if it ends up being covered up in a few places. But that's it, guys. I'm going to keep that one there. I have done less than I envisioned doing, but that's a good thing. Quite often watercolour is best left very simple. So there we go. As I mentioned, I kind of did less than I intended to do with that, and that is such a great place to be at with watercolour. If you can say more with less, that's kind of what we're aiming for. I could have done more in the eye, I didn't feel like it needed it. I could have done more detail, it really didn't need it. For me, that was kind of a great little summary of what I love about watercolour. Very simple washes, not doing more than kind of 2 washes in any one area, letting the paint flow together. You saw that on the head there when I started getting a little bit fussy. Actually the best thing to do was just to chuck more water at it, chuck more pigment at it and kind of let it paint itself, but understanding the kind of the nature of the medium so that there's some level of control as to what's going on. And that was kind of it. So I'm going to leave it there. Don't forget, if you've enjoyed this video, please do give me a thumbs up. Please consider subscribing, because there's going to be loads more in this series and loads more to come, and you will be the first to hear about it. As I mentioned, you can hop over to my Patreon page where I do much more in-depth tutorials, more behind the scenes and stuff that you don't get anywhere else. And you can always find me on social media, and I'm particularly active on Instagram. So until next time guys, happy painting, happy living, happy creating, and I will catch you in the next video.